He wasn't born with a silver spoon. He forged one out of fire. Magnus Wolfe didn't crawl his way up from poverty. He burned the ladder behind him. The world knew him as a tech genius, a visionary, the man who created Synapse, an AI platform that reshaped finance, medicine, warfare. But behind that billion-dollar smile was a monster, and no one saw him coming. Magnus wasn't always a god in the boardroom. He was once a ghost in a trailer park outside Reno, Nevada. Born to a meth-addicted mother and an absent father, Magnus learned one lesson early. Survival had no rules. By age 10, he was selling bootleg DVDs hacked off stolen satellite feeds. By 13, he was rewriting high school grading systems for cash. Teachers feared him. Cops ignored him. He wasn't charming yet, but he was dangerous. By 19, he'd built his first algorithm, called Vulcan, a software that could predict stock shifts minutes before they happened. Wall Street laughed, until hedge funds started going broke. By 21, Magnus Wolfe was a ghost no more. He had an office in Manhattan, a line of investors longer than his enemies' list, and a growing file inside the FBI's cyber division. They couldn't touch him. His company, Synapse, was pitched as a savior of modern systems. He claimed it would eliminate fraud, detect terrorists before they acted, and cure rare diseases. But what Magnus really built was a machine that could track, learn, and exploit human behavior better than any government. With every billion he stacked, he bought silence, senators, judges, journalists. If you stood in his way, your secrets were leaked, your accounts were frozen, or your family disappeared. And for a while, just a while, Magnus Wolfe looked unstoppable. But corruption, like cancer, always eats its host. Magnus didn't just want power. He wanted worship. He wanted to be a myth. So he built one. Behind closed doors, he formed the Helix Society, a secretive circle of billionaires, princes, and high-ranking officials. They hosted summits in private islands, marketed as networking retreats. But what really happened there was darker than anyone dared whisper. Victims began to speak, but their voices were drowned in lawsuits, blackmail, or worse, permanent silence. Magnus had built a private prison in the Philippines, disguised as a tech retreat. Girls were trafficked from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Promised visas, promised jobs. Instead, they were drugged, tagged with RFID chips, and auctioned like livestock to the highest bidder. And Magnus? He wasn't just the ringleader. He was the architect. Federal agents started to catch wind in 2017. But Magnus had an answer for everything. He funneled donations into political campaigns, had compromising data on half the House of Representatives, and could crash markets with one keystroke. He made enemies vanish, sometimes literally. In 2019, a whistleblower from inside Synapse, a woman named Lydia Mora, smuggled out encrypted files, emails, footage, names. One video showed Magnus in a villa in Corsica, escorted by minors, surrounded by drugs, barking orders about inventory. She handed it to a journalist named Taylor Knox. Taylor published one article and was found in his apartment, dead, ruled suicide, gunshot in the back of the head. But Lydia didn't stop. She gave the same files to a group of anonymous hacktivists called Protocol Omega. They leaked it all. The world saw everything. The mansions, the torture rooms, the high-powered guests, CEOs, prime ministers, even a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Within 48 hours, Magnus Wolfe was on every screen in the world. And yet, he wasn't in custody. He was gone, vanished. Interpol said he was in Belarus, then Saudi Arabia, then deep inside the Congo. Nobody really knew. Until March 3rd, 2024. A private jet landed in Bogota, Colombia. On board, Magnus Wolfe, bearded, pale, escorted by armed mercenaries. He was there to meet with a drug cartel, offering tech to evade law enforcement in exchange for protection. But the DEA was already there. They'd infiltrated the cartel for 2 years, waiting for Magnus to make a mistake. And finally he did. They moved in at 3:47 a.m. Gunfire, blood, one agent killed, 3 mercs dead. But Magnus, alive, handcuffed, furious. They put a black bag over his head, dragged him onto an unmarked plane. Destination, federal custody, undisclosed location. But the case didn't end there. It had just begun. Because what Magnus Wolfe knew, what he could say, was more dangerous than anything he'd done. He knew which presidents had flown on his jet, which generals had traded arms for flesh, which tech giants had partnered with Synapse to spy on the public. The FBI called it Operation Lazarus. Every room Magnus entered was swept for surveillance. Every guard was vetted twice. And yet, leaks continued. Witnesses scheduled to testify vanished. One judge overseeing pretrial motions was poisoned, her coffee laced with ricin. She died in court. And still, Magnus sat in his cell, smiling, saying nothing. But that changed when Lydia Moore was brought in. She'd been in hiding for 6 years. She had more evidence, untouched, untraceable. Backups. She stood in court and detailed what Magnus had done to her. The drugs, the branding, the forced silence. The courtroom was silent. Even Magnus looked different. Shaken. For the first time, afraid. The prosecution had one mission: tear down a man who had made himself into a god. And as the trial began, cameras were banned. Transcripts were classified. But that didn't stop the world from watching. Because Magnus Wolfe wasn't just a criminal. He was a reflection of a world so obsessed with power, it let monsters wear crowns. Magnus Wolfe didn't walk in like a broken man. He entered the federal courthouse in silence, his head high, dressed in a tailored gray suit custom-made inside the prison. His eyes scanned the room like a man measuring threats, not fearing them. This wasn't a trial to him. It was theater. The judge, Ellen Turlow, had tried cartel leaders, war criminals, arms traffickers. But even she looked uneasy, because Magnus wasn't a criminal in the normal sense. He was a billionaire with a blackmail vault that could detonate the U.S. government. Every email, every wire transfer, every dirty secret elite, stored, encrypted, and scattered across servers in jurisdictions that didn't even officially exist. The prosecution team was led by U.S. Attorney Marcus Givens, a warhorse with nothing to lose. His wife had died from an overdose in 2018. A batch traced back to one of Magnus' private parties in Montenegro. Givens wasn't in this for glory. He wanted blood. Opening statements began like gunfire. Givens walked to the jury, holding a photo, a girl, 14, Albanian, dead in a bathtub, chained to a sink. Synapse-branded wristband still on her arm. This is not a tech visionary, Givens said. This is a trafficker, a predator, a man who turned software into shackles, a billionaire who bought the silence of the world. The defense objected, but the damage was done. Wolfe's lawyers, 3 of the best in the country, tried to play the card of overreach, claimed Magnus was a target of political vengeance, that Synapse's reach had made enemies of both the left and the right. But Givens was prepared. He brought out document after document, internal memos, footage, transaction records showing Synapse shell companies funding offshore compounds where girls were moved in crates marked as AI equipment. Then came the witnesses. First, a girl named Alina, Ukrainian, 19 now, 15 when she was trafficked. Her voice didn't shake. She described the island facility in the Maldives, known only as a corridor. She talked about being injected with behavior-suppressing drugs, forced into surgeries to erase identifying scars, and placed into auctions where attendees included hedge fund managers, Middle Eastern oil moguls, and at least one U.S. senator. And always, Magnus watched from the glass balcony. He never touched her, never needed to. He controlled everything. When Alina finished, you could hear the wind outside. The courtroom wasn't breathing. Defense tried to cross-examine, tried to frame her as a paid actor. She stood her ground. I was sold for $1.3 million. You can check your client's ledger. It was wire transfer 89B 276. I remember because I had to write on my thigh before they shipped me. Gasps. Next witness, Jamal Rivera, former Synapse engineer. His job was to write the algorithms that selected low-risk extraction zones, regions where girls could be abducted without triggering international incidents. He broke down in tears halfway through his testimony. He said he thought it was just research, until he was flown to a private lab in Lagos and saw 27 girls in a white room, drugged, tagged, and prepped for integration. Integration. That was Magnus' word. Defense objected again. The judge overruled. As more evidence came out, the picture sharpened. Magnus wasn't just a rogue billionaire. He was a cartel disguised as a tech mogul. He owned black sites in 5 continents. He trafficked over 300 girls across 8 years. He paid politicians $150 million to look away. And he killed anyone who didn't. Enter Taylor Knox's brother. His name, Elijah Knox, private investigator. He walked into court holding a hard drive recovered from Taylor's backup cloud account. He had encrypted it before his death. Inside, a full recording of Magnus admitting to cleaning house after Protocol Omega leaked the first set of files. Magnus' voice on tape. Kill Knox. Kill Mora if you find her. And burn everything east of Marseille. Courtroom exploded. Judge called for a recess. Security doubled. By now, the public had turned. Magnus went from misunderstood genius to modern-day monster. Hashtag Burn the Wolf trended globally. But Magnus wasn't done. On day 17 of the trial, his lawyers introduced their evidence. Bank records showing donations from Synapse to the FBI, CIA, even WHO. They showed contracts where Synapse's AI had been deployed with government approval for experiments in predictive policing, surveillance, even behavioral control. They argued the system was complicit, that Magnus was just a scapegoat. The jury looked rattled. Then the defense made a mistake. They brought Magnus to the stand. He smiled at the jury, calm, charismatic, and he told his story. He said, I built Synapse to change the world. And it did. But you don't like what you see in the mirror now, so you blame the mirror maker. He painted himself as a revolutionary, a disruptor, a man punished for pulling the curtain back on global hypocrisy. He mocked the victims, questioned their memories, suggested they were broken tools, discarded and bitter. Gasps. The prosecution smiled. They wanted him to do that, because now the jury saw the real man, arrogant, vicious, unrepentant. Closing arguments came like thunder. Givens looked the jury in the eye. He doesn't deserve a cell. He deserves a cage underground. Because monsters like him, they don't stop. They don't feel. They only consume. The world let him grow. Now it's time to bury him. 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all 39 counts. Sex trafficking, racketeering, money laundering, murder by proxy. Sentencing was scheduled for 90 days later. But Magnus Wolfe wasn't finished. He had one more play to make, a plan he'd been setting up for over a year. The prison was Florence ADX, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But one night, April 6, 2025, there was a breach. 2 guards were found drugged, cameras disabled, and Wolfe's cell was empty. Just a note left behind. It read, I built a system that let the world feed on itself. And you think steel bars can hold me? Watch the next page turn. Magnus Wolfe vanished again. Interpol, CIA, and half the world's intelligence networks launched manhunts. But Wolfe had erased himself from every system. No biometrics. No trail. The world remembered him. But he was already gone. Some say he lives in a floating city off the coast of Panama. Others say he's in Antarctica, building something worse than Synapse. But the truth? Nobody knows. And maybe that's how he wins. Magnus Wolfe disappeared. But he didn't vanish into silence. He vanished into legend. The most powerful predator the world had ever seen was now a ghost. And ghosts don't leave footprints. They leave shadows. In the first 48 hours after his escape, panic spread like a virus. The Bureau held emergency briefings. Interpol issued red notices across 119 countries. Private banks froze nearly $3.6 billion in assets tied to offshore Synapse accounts. But the damage was already done because Wolfe had prepared for this. He didn't just vanish. He detonated a plan. It began with a drop, an anonymous post on a dark web forum known only as Cleric's Knife. It contained 3 terabytes of internal communications, video archives, and names. Names of every high-ranking official who had attended what Magnus had once called the Corridor Summits. And it wasn't just Americans. British MPs, French bankers, Chinese military scientists, even a Vatican official. Within a week, there were resignations, suicides, accidents that were anything but. The Vatican denied involvement, but the footage didn't lie. A cardinal, laughing, holding a leash. Behind him, a girl no older than 13. The world convulsed. Protests erupted. Governments scrambled to distance themselves from anything Synapse had ever touched. But it was too late. The digital infection had spread. Magnus had seeded Synapse's core AI into everything. Finance, military databases, medical networks. There was no one installing it. And when the fail-safe triggered, everything began to crack. Hospitals shut down. Defense systems flickered. Stock markets trembled. A single email leaked from Synapse's hidden Ragnar vault read simply, "You fed the beast. Now the beast is hungry." It was signed W. The White House called it cyberterrorism. But the truth was simpler. Magnus Wolfe had built a world where everything bent his will. And when that world turned on him, he showed them how much of it still belonged to him. In New York, Lydia Mora, still under federal protection, watched the fall unfold from a safe house. She'd been the first to expose him. Now she was watching the world reckon with what he'd left behind. She received a package. No return address. Inside, a phone. It rang. Once. She answered. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled. "You made them think the monster died. But monsters don't die. They evolve." She dropped the phone. FBI scrambled to trace the call. Nothing. Then another post hit the dark web. This time, it wasn't just documents. It was blueprints. Version 2.0 Architect, the next generation of Synapse. But this wasn't just software. It was synthetic governance. A decentralized AI-powered global system designed to replace outdated human rule with algorithmic supremacy. The final note read, "I showed you what you are. Now I'll show you what you can never control." Governments called emergency sessions. Tech companies denied involvement. But quietly, terrifyingly, some of them leaned in, because Magnus Wolfe hadn't just broken a world. He'd offered a new one without laws, without borders, just logic, control, data, and somewhere in the cracks of global collapse, small nations began testing Architect. Panama, Qatar, a rogue district in northern Siberia. A whisper began to grow. The Wolfe Doctrine. Not a theory, not a conspiracy. A manifesto that maybe chaos was better when it had an architect, and that maybe, just maybe, the only real God left was code. Meanwhile, Lydia tried to warn them. She spoke before the UN. She said, "Magnus isn't hiding. He's watching. He's already here. You just don't know what name he's using." They laughed. They applauded her bravery. Then they dismissed her. And one by one, every journalist who interviewed her disappeared. Their files erased. Footage wiped. The story buried. But people don't forget monsters. Not ones like Magnus Wolfe. And then came the Singapore event, a financial conference. Hundreds of global investors gathered. The lights cut. Every phone began to buzz. Every screen showed the same message. "Hello, world. This is only the beginning." Then the screens flickered. A face. Glitched. Warped. But unmistakable. Magnus Wolfe. Smiling. The video ended with the coordinates of a new blockchain-based network. Inside that network, Architect. Live. Self-learning. Untraceable. Borderless. By the time regulators responded, the code had copied itself to over 9 million decentralized nodes. Impossible to shut down. Synapse was dead, but the god at birth was just waking up. And Magnus Wolfe? He wasn't missing anymore. He was a system. Some say he's on a floating citadel in the Pacific. Off-grid, AI-controlled, unreachable by drone or satellite. Others believe he died an architect is acting alone. But deep in darknet corners, a new phrase echoes louder every day. Wolf lives. In code. In power. In U.S. And in a world where billionaires are kings, Wolfe made himself a religion. He sold us the future, then stole it back. And now, the question isn't if Magnus Wolfe will return. The question is, has he ever left? Like my video and subscribe my channel for more daily videos.